So it's been said often enough that different media can provide different experiences. Books are the ideal place for long-spun metaphors, while films are the go-to for spectacle and action. When a property crosses over into a transmedia phenomenon, there is always some tension there. Harry Potter looks very much like Daniel Radcliffe to the vast majority of people, and New Zealand is Middle-earth. Dungeons & Dragons is about as transmedia as it gets. Tabletop games, books, films, animated TV shows, actual plays, and, of course, the star of the moment, video games. Of course, the history of Dungeons & Dragons video games is long and complex and deserves not just its own video, but a whole other channel. This is not the time for that history. But it is universally true that adapting D&D into different forms requires some careful thought. Nonetheless, transmission problems occur when adapting Dungeons & Dragons into any other media form. And it probably shouldn't surprise you that even if it stays within the broad media sphere of gaming, transmitting a game one-to-one across genres or media presentations just isn't possible. Today I want to talk to you about one of the concepts that really fails to make the leap from tabletop to screen, and how we can best value what each form of media can do for our enjoyment of a property. After all, we're not playing Baldur's Gate 3 to replace our Dungeon Masters, I hope. We're playing it for a high-fidelity, visual, audio and gameplay medium which evokes the setting of the Forgotten Realms and tells a narratively compelling story. The clearest example of something that utterly fails to make the leap from tabletop game to video game is present from the very start. It is illusion magic. Our magical options are limited, as are the ways we could potentially creatively use them. Minor illusion is a particularly egregious example. In Larian's wonderful and very rich game, minor illusion essentially boils down to summoning a small totemic marker which causes the people around you to potentially be distracted by it. You can't create a small illusory box and hide behind or inside it, put on dancing illusion light shows for the local children, nor visually communicate what an object or person looks like in the palm of your hand using only magic. Indeed, within a few minutes of my personal start of the game, I chose to disguise myself as a female Gith, in the vain hope that perhaps I could trick my captors into thinking I was more dangerous than I was, or, at very least, maybe wrangle my way into riding a cool dragon. However, by the first cutscene of the game, I was back to staring at my original self. My magical disguise had all but evaporated, and there was no hesitation or even comment from the NPC I was attempting to disguise myself as. Of course, even with Baldur's Gate 3 being one of the most ambitious choice-driven RPGs ever, there is still not time in the day nor money in the bank to program every single possible creative, weird and wonderful solution a player might try to make using a magic system that is as broad as the one in Dungeons & Dragons. It just can't be done in a modern video game. The thing is, though, ever since the early days of Dungeons & Dragons, the illusionist has been a part of the game, albeit having gone through many revisions over the years. They're one of the 8 wizard subclasses released with the 5th edition Player's Handbook, and illusion magic is a popular roleplay choice, especially among bards, wizards, and of course, the arcane trickster. Forever and a day, there has been debate in the TTRPG community about the DM's role in validating and allowing the creativity of their players to shine through and gain effect. You see, it's not just a video game problem that illusion magics keep getting the short end of the stick. The sad reality is that any game is only as creatively open as the sum of its players and game masters' creative bandwidth. In Larian's case, they, as game designers, are analogous to game masters. They try and anticipate and manipulate the desires of their player base, and provide an experience designed to respond to those player desires. The main constraints here are time, money, manpower, and deadlines. In not so stark contrast, we have the tabletop game master. They are unlikely to need to invest time or money in designing an entire gaming system for their players, but are still very much required to anticipate and manipulate the desires of their players, to provide a semi-designed experience, and to respond to player wishes and wants. They have similar constraints, but one key tool that game designers don't have: improvisation. Try as AI might, it can't yet improvise like a good old-fashioned human. And a video game certainly can't. But suggesting that any given GM can respond well to any given player action is idealistic at best and downright foolish at worst. It's equally as unrealistic as the commonly spouted tip that your players are going to try their best to blow everything you've prepared to smithereens. Remember, the game can only get as far off the rails as the players are willing to iterate and become creative, or as far off the rails as the GM is capable or willing to react to player behaviour. Illusion is the archetypal example for this sort of thing for a reason. It begins with player ingenuity. They try to make something incredibly situational to solve a presented problem creatively, and it ends with a GM reaction, who has to adjudicate the effectiveness or practicality of the solution and determine the response of the world to this development. In reality, illusion magic is itself a microcosm of the game designer's task, to react to the things that the players want to do in a way which allows for individual player expression while maintaining some degree of verisimilitude and control. This problem gets to the very heart of game design, and it's quite fitting, really, that we're using illusions to get here. There are various approaches to this issue, some of which are on display in Baldur's Gate 3, and others of which have been seen at Dungeons & Dragons tables the world over. But they all relate to a universal constant of games which purport to be based in player choice. It's an illusion. It's always an illusion. I mentioned earlier that the task of a good game master is to anticipate and manipulate the desires of their players. Although many game masters don't want to admit it, perhaps even to themselves, the way we present information to our players is one of the main ways that we manipulate them. In the same way that dialogue trees shape our response to the world of a video game. If there's 3 options and they are usually good, neutral, and bad, you tend to get sucked into a kind of moral binary way of thinking for the entire runtime of the game. So too do our descriptors, interactions, and even external emotional cues give our players an insight into what we want. Exactly the same is true the other way round as well. The illusion in any game where your choices matter, from Dungeons & Dragons to Lancer, from Mass Effect to Baldur's Gate 3, is that there isn't a designer or a team of them secretly hoping that you're going to select one of the paths that they've actually made, instead of running your head up against the same unplanned, unremarkable wall for half an hour. Unless you're From Software, but that's a special kind of game design. The designer wants, most of all, for you to have fun with their game, and for that illusion to be maintained. The moment you try something creative, and it fails because the designers simply didn't plan for it, it feels pretty rubbish. But those moments where your off-the-wall creativity is rewarded feel like magic. Back to illusions. Real illusions. Well, pretend illusions as opposed to metaphorical illusions. It's no secret that Larian decided that the cost to develop a robust and creative illusion system was simply too great. The human cost, the development cost, the financial cost, and the cost to the launch of the game. Perhaps even the cost to the story they wanted to tell. It makes perfect sense as a business decision. It's certainly one way to deal with the problem of transmedia adaptation. Get rid of the stuff that isn't going to work in your adaptation. In actual fact, they do this very successfully in the case of the much maligned alignment system, itself a holdover from the early days of Dungeons & Dragons, which is quite simply kicked to the curb in Baldur's Gate 3. But while alignment was unpopular, and not particularly integral to the functioning fabric of 5th edition, illusion magic has quite a few fans. Besides, some of these spells in the illusion school can't simply be left out of any D&D themed video game. Invisibility, disguise self, fear, silence. These are mainstays of the game, and need to live somewhere in a comprehensive adaptation. So like any beleaguered game master whose player wants to play an Aarakocra or an Owlin, Larian went the Reddit route and simply made illusion magic exist, but in a somewhat weakened state, paring down the number of uses it can potentially have. The myriad potential presentations of illusionists in fantasy are narrowed down to one potential option: a magic-based stealth build. Notwithstanding the use of disguise self as a way to ingratiate yourself with various factions in the game, which is a very useful and creative method of making that spell work. But mostly, Baldur's Gate 3 interprets illusion magic as an assistive tool for sneaking around and tricking people. To some extent, this works. It's a decent compromise to fit the trends of modern RPG game design. It largely reinterprets illusion magic as an assistive tool for sneaking around. But the wild creativity made possible by a TTRPG is absent. You're not an arcane trickster so much as an arcane distractor. Much like our beleaguered GM, one of the main and more powerful factors in choosing your unique concept is handicapped. In essence, the concept's wings are clipped, much like any GM who decides that if you play a flying race, you should be taking double fall damage because your bones are hollow. In the end, I don't envy Larian. I see, writ in larger scale, of course, many of the issues which game masters have been facing for quite some time in the tabletop space. Of course, they have the benefits of playtesting, a huge team, and a great many supporters of their game, even from the early stages. But what links both them and us is that we both know it's impossible to maintain the illusion. Baldur's Gate 3 isn't D&D. Heck, it's not open world, and it's not a sandbox. It's a story, writ large, made to as best as possible accommodate the myriad creative choices that players are likely to make along the way. When we adapt our media, we change it. No two versions of the Forgotten Realms are the same. From the one in the setting book, to the one on the silver screen, to the one in Baldur's Gate, to the one that we create collaboratively, if we choose to play that setting at the table. We can try our best to anticipate the direction our world will go in. And to some extent we can mould our audience's expectations, desires and wants. But there will inevitably come a day when you are playing a game that some player decides to do something that you haven't prepared for. That's why many of us love tabletop games. While Larian's response to the problem of illusions is tied inherently to the modern landscape of AAA games, the constraints of budget, and the limitations of video games as a technical medium, I, as a singular entity capable of engaging directly with my players in real time, am not. I theoretically have the ability to respond and react in any way that I can possibly imagine. But being there in front of your players, even if they can only hear your voice, there's no way to hide the pause before that tentative okay. No way to disguise my frantic scribbling as I sketch down my own world's lore while I'm in the middle of describing it to them. And no way to disguise the falsehood. That is, you know what guys, this seems like a great place for a break. Let's just, let's all take 5 minutes to grab a glass of water and we'll catch up in 5 minutes. See you then. Even with all the tools at my disposal, I can't maintain the illusion. I don't need to. Larian needs to tuck their changes behind functions and different spell descriptions in how the illusion spells work. Needs to carefully cable tie their branching paths so that they all reconverge at certain key story elements. Player immersion is sought in a completely different way. Where they're the Wizard of Oz, I am quite proudly the man behind the GM curtain. I and I alone have the freedom to say, absolutely. Absolutely not. Or, that's absolutely brilliant. I am going to need 5 minutes to figure out what the heck I'm going to do. My point, if there is one, is that we should take pride in our ability to react more authentically than a mass-produced product. And we should value such products' abilities to immerse us in a veritable feast of gaming luxury. But remember, if a developer as large and established as Larian can't figure out a way to make illusions work how some people might want them to, it's foolish to expect your game master, who might not have the experience, creativity, or improvisational chops, or even the time or energy to do the same. This game we play is a social negotiation. So if you feel like something like a creative use of illusion magic isn't getting the credit, the kudos, or the reaction that you want in your tabletop game, you don't need to react the same way as you might with a large-scale video game producer by heading to the forums to complain or simply abandoning the game for good. As with almost every problem in tabletop gaming, it's best if you simply talk it out. After all, being just a bunch of nerds around a real or virtual table means that there's no illusion, no veil between the creatives and the audience. We're all in the crab pot together. Let's not drag each other down. Thank you for watching. This has been a bit of an unusual one, but I hope it's given you some insight into the ways that game design is affected by the simple introduction of a new type of media. This video has taken many forms. It originally began as an attempt to complain about some of the problems I saw with illusion magic in Baldur's Gate 3, and then morphed into this, an examination of how we all rely on illusions for verisimilitude in our game design, and how we can all benefit from a little bit of a step back sometimes, looking at the bigger picture and finding out what we actually want. The whole point of all of these games is to try and give people what they want, after all. Why else would we sit down in a GM's chair and expose ourselves, make ourselves vulnerable, were it not for the hopes of entertaining people and giving them something that they want or they didn't even know they want? Anyway, just a few thoughts on illusion magic, the illusion of choice, and how that's a useful tool for all of us to get our hands on. With that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. If you'd like more videos in a more game design philosophy sense, please do let me know by commenting and subscribing. But for now, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I'll see you in the next video.